from inside the Capitol, photos from inside the Capitol at the end of session. It brought back very clear and vivid memories and very clear and vivid feelings about the work that we did together to pass what we consider, what I believe is nation-leading workplace safety legislation. But it also reminds me of the pieces that we didn't get across the line. And as we talked about the package of legislation that we know as Keeping Nurses at the Bedside Act, the workplace violence and workplace safety initiatives that were embedded in that bill were really, really important. But they were not the primary focus of the legislature. The legislature chose to focus primarily on the staffing committees and the ways in which those would be implemented or litigated, if you will, or the questions would be litigated. And so important provisions like this one didn't get nearly the same amount of attention, but that's okay. Because the work that you had done, the organization had done to build a powerful section of the legislation that is now law to protect nurses in the workplace from the ever-growing violence that they're experiencing was well vetted, well researched. And when we brought it back to the Senate and the House for final passage, it was well supported. Because we've made the case, and you in particular have made the eloquent case that the working conditions for nurses in hospitals have changed significantly. And that is in part because of the way hospitals are being staffed. And that, of course, is contributing to what can become workplace hazards, and workplace violence can be advanced when there aren't enough nurses to care for patients. But we know that there are a lot of conditions that are contributing to a lack of safety in the workplace for nurses. And we wanted to make sure that the hospitals were both responsible and had tools to deal with that ever increasing amount of violence that people are experiencing. So this, from my perspective, was a real victory for us, despite the things that got left behind. And I think it is something, and I hope it is something that will make a meaningful difference for the practice of nursing inside our hospitals here in Minnesota. So it is something that I am incredibly proud to be a part of, and want to work to make sure that as it's implemented, that we're doing it in a way that makes the meaning come to life for you and your practice. And as always, we continue to work, and I will be working, I think, a meeting with some of the M&A crew tomorrow to talk about the provisions that we hope to move through the next session. And I know that is going to be part of your agenda for this evening. And I look forward to talking with Katie and the balance of staff to talk about the items that are most important to you, so we can do the best that we can do to move those into law and get them before the legislature in the next session. And with that, I'm happy to turn it back to you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Erin. We always appreciate your time, and we know that it's really busy. So thank you so much more. On that note, I'm going to talk about this really wonky policy that really matters a lot. And so bear with me, and we'll have our contact information at the end. So please reach out to me if you have any questions. But part of the labor package that the AFL-CIO brought was to work on workers' compensation benefits. And so we've been going to the Workers' Comp Advisory Council asking for nurses to be eligible for presumptive eligibility, and that for PTSD benefits. So that means when you apply for the benefit, you're automatically assumed that the conditions of your workplace is what led to your diagnosis of PTSD and other mental health diagnoses, though those aren't covered very well under the Minnesota Workers' Compensation Program as it is. And so we've been fighting this battle, and we've been losing this battle year after year at the Workers' Comp Advisory Council, which is half business interests and half labor interests. Through all of that work, we worked with the commissioner at the Department of Labor and Industry, which is the DOLLY acronym you'll see on the screen. And the commissioner was a really great advocate for nurses, and she provided us a lot of data and insight onto how the workers' compensation program works and how it's not working. And the outcome of all this work and all nurse testimony and the work that you've all done to show that the workers' compensation program needs to be changed is there were benefit changes to make it easier to apply for the benefit, more accessible for workers to access it and increase the benefit amount, which I don't think it had been increased for decades. I might be wrong about that, but it had been quite a long time. The other piece of this that is most important for the work that we've been doing is they will also be doing a study on how PTSD works within the workers' compensation system and ways to make mental health diagnoses easier to receive benefits when you have those diagnoses, and ensuring that the right populations have access to the tools that they need in order to receive the benefits they are eligible for. So we know there are not enough nurses applying for workers' compensation when they have a diagnosis of PTSD. It's traumatizing. The experience is re-traumatizing. And then you're denied the benefits when you apply. And if you had presumptive eligibility, you might still have a fight for that benefit, but you would be more likely to get a settlement agreement at the end. And the commissioner at the Department of Labor and Industry heard all of this and now really wants to hear nurse voice as part of the study that passed at the legislature. So this study obviously isn't the same as getting presumptive eligibility or ensuring that you have the access that you need to apply for this benefit, but it is a start, and it is a meaningful start under the current labor commissioner. And they are hiring a team at the University of Minnesota who are specifically told they have to listen to nurse stories. And we need your help getting nurse stories to those researchers. And so again, my contact information will be at the end. But if you have a story about applying for the benefits that you would like to share, please reach out to me. If you know colleagues who have applied for workers' compensation for mental health diagnoses, please share my contact with them. If you just have opinions about how the system should work better, or if you've applied for something other than mental health and see how the system should work better, we would love to hear from you. And so again, my contact information will be at the end. And if you have any questions, any concerns that come up, I'm here to answer those questions, because I know this is really complicated policy, but really it's just making the benefit work better for nurses. And how do we get your stories as part of that work to make the benefit work better? And on that note, I'm going to get into the content of what we had planned for the night. So I'm going to turn it over to our commissioners at, NP&E and our practice team to lead the next section of the work.
Can you move on to the next slide, Katie? No. So we just want to, my name's Jerry Katz, and I work with our Practice and Education Commission. I'm M&A staff. And the first thing to note is just that this presentation may bring up some scary or traumatic feelings, make you reflect back on something that's happened to you in the past. So just please take care of yourself. If at any time you need to step away for a minute or 10 minutes or for the whole event, you do what's best for you, and we will carry on. So with that, we'll introduce Michelle Knipe, who is a registered nurse and one of the commissioners on M&A's Nursing Practice and Education Commission.
Thanks, Jerry and Katie. You can go to the next slide. And I'm going to apologize for the light. I'm not trying to look like a Halloween ghoul. It just makes it easier for me to see my notes. So first, we're going to start with some legal definition of workplace violence. This definition comes from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. Workplace violence is an act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at the workplace. Please note that you don't have to be physically assaulted to have experienced violence. Verbal abuse, threats, and intimidation are also considered violence. Violence against U.S. healthcare workers has been on the rise for at least a decade. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics data, the incidence of violence-related healthcare worker injuries has increased by 67% from 2011 to 2018. And as we know, for many of us, things have gotten worse since the COVID lockdown. The healthcare and social service industries experience the highest rates of injuries caused by workplace violence and are 5 times as likely to suffer a workplace violence injury than workers overall, comprising a whopping 73% of non-fatal workplace injuries and illness requiring days away from work. And as we've heard in the news lately, there has been more violence and actually attacks on nurses at times with patients trying to kill them. So next slide. Violence can come from patients, from their family members or their visitors, or from other healthcare workers, including physicians, managers, supervisors, and other nurses. The first type of violence is in criminal intent. The perpetrator has no legitimate reason or relationship, to the business, so they're not a patient or a visitor or its employees, and is usually committing a crime in conjunction with the violence: robbery, shoplifting, trespassing. For example, if you were walking in or out of the shift and someone attacked you, or someone damaged your car when you were in working, that would be a criminal intent. The second type, customer, client, or patient visitor violence, is the most common that we see in healthcare settings. This type of violence occurs more frequently in the emergency room and on psychiatric units. Waiting rooms and geriatric settings are also places where we see more violence, but it's by no means limited, as we know, to these areas. It could be on any unit at any time. This can include patients or patient visitors. The third type of violence is between co-workers, and we commonly refer to this as lateral or horizontal violence. It includes bullying and frequently manifests as verbal or emotional abuse that is unfair, offensive, vindictive, and or humiliating, though it can range all the way to homicide. Worker-on-worker violence is often directed at persons viewed as being lower on the food chain. So, for example, a supervisor to a supervisee, or a doctor to a nurse, though the incidence of peer-to-peer violence is also common. I think sometimes we see this when we talk about nurses eating their young. Sometimes without intention, we can be abusive or neglectful to a newer nurse. In type 4 violence, the perpetrator has a relationship to the nurse outside of work that spills over into the work environment. Next slide. So what puts nurses at risk? Personal factors like the nurse's age or gender, the amount of time they spend with patients, or as little amount of time sometimes, as opposed to other healthcare worker classifications, and the acceptance of violence put toward the nurse at a greater risk of violence, puts the nurse at greater risk of violence. How many times have nurses been told it's part of your job? And working short-staffed is a clear risk factor as well. So we had a doctor one time came into a room and a patient was abusing a nurse, and the nurse was upset, and he told her it's just part of your job. That's compiling the violence on top of the violence. Environmental risk factors are related to the layout design and amenities of the physical workspace. They include factors like the opportunity to gain access or avoid detection such as unmonitored entries or stairwells, insufficient lighting, blind corners, unsecured rooms, or closets. Opportunities to use things like unsecured furniture, fixtures, decorative items, office or medical supplies as weapons. So for example, we saw some of this in the assault of the St. John's nurses. An IV pulse standard that's part of the bed was taken off and used as an assault weapon. Staff's ability to appropriately respond to violent incidents, such as the lack of security systems, alarms, or devices. Building design that doesn't allow nurses quick ways out of the room. For example, we've heard of a brand new ED that has the triage nurse in a small room behind a desk, her back to the wall or his back to the wall, with the patient between them and the doorway. I know the triage room for Unity is set up this way, although it is glassed and there is a security guard usually nearby, not always. The way nurses practice may put them at risk also. Factors include working alone, staffing patterns, shift changes are always dangerous. I think many of you have probably noticed at shift change that patients tend to get more riled up. And lack of training about violence prevention. Nurses also face systematic issues like long wait times for care, insufficient security personnel, care for mentally ill patients who are not receiving the care that they need or are released without follow-up care, and care for patients who are in the criminal justice system without adequate safeguards. I know sometimes we've gotten patients from the jail, and sometimes a guard stays with them and sometimes one doesn't. Don't always know the reasoning for that, but it always makes you a little more nervous if there's no guard there. An overall trend that encompasses many of the risk factors is the corporate